We're here in the desert with Jeff Toobin, author of 10, count them 10 books, if you include, as we must, the book that's just come out today, The Pardon, The Politics of Presidential Mercy. Jeff, great to be here.
Harry, good to see you in this wonderful environment here in the California desert.
There you have it. Okay, so we've been focusing, a lot of people have, on pardons as they've come across with the Biden pardons and, of course, the Trump January 6th pardons. Your book focuses a fair bit on the Ford pardon of Nixon. I think as the sort of national folklore has come down on that pardon, it was Ford, in a statesmanlike way, ending our national nightmare, putting Nixon and the whole Sturm und Drang of the previous couple years behind us, and in that sense, wise and prudent. My sense is you, in your new book, have a very different take on it.
I do. Well, what's interesting about the Ford pardon is that the conventional wisdom about it has shifted almost 180 degrees. When Ford did it on September 9th, 1974, just a month after he had
August 8th
taken
was
over.
resignation.
August 8th was the resignation speech. It was effective August 9th. Mm-hmm. And there was a storm of outrage when the pardon happened. Ford's popularity dropped 40 points in 1 week. The Democratic Party was united in opposition, and the conventional wisdom arose that it was a key factor in his defeat by Jimmy Carter 2 years later in the presidential election. Okay, and that was, I think, how things stood for a long time. As Ford got older and as time passed, there was a real shift in the conventional wisdom about it, and it was symbolized by an event in May of 2001 at the Kennedy Library in Boston, where Ted Kennedy gave the Profiles in Courage Award to Gerald Ford for the pardon, and gave a speech there saying, I was wrong to criticize you, and you were right. Bob Woodward, who was very critical of the pardon, wrote a chapter in a book in connection with that award saying he was wrong, that the pardon was the right thing to do. And interestingly, even in the oral argument of the Trump versus United States case, Brett Kavanaugh, sort of in passing, says, well, Ford was criticized, but everyone agrees now that he did the right thing. All of which, just to sort of for the long introduction, I think the original view was correct. I think the pardon was bad. I think it was well intentioned. I don't think there was a sinister conspiracy theory, which I address at some length in the book, that Ford made a deal that if you resign and make me president, I will give you a pardon. That deal never happened.
Then Nixon actually solicited such a deal, yeah?
Well, see, that's where things start to get complicated.
You know what?
Yeah.
Well, I want to go back to your view on it, but this is something that everyone's interested in as well. What's your best reporting or state of knowledge about the quid pro quo or not of the actual pardon?
I mean, one of the great things about doing this at some remove is that you really have a lot of archival research to work with. And to put it simply, a lot of the pardon history comes down to a single day and a single meeting. August 1st, a week before Nixon resigns, Alexander Haig, who was the last White House chief of staff for Nixon, and then
the acting
Ford's
president
first.
for a few days, as he put it,
all
self-appointed,
but,
right?
yes.
And because just remember, we have a whole mess up with the vice presidency at that point too, and Rockefeller, Agnew,
right. Well, that comes in later. But Haig goes to Ford and says, "You have a number of options," and he presents them in such a way that pardoning Nixon is the best option. So he really solicits a
And
pardon.
Ford is the vice president.
Ford is the vice president, but by that point, the smoking gun tape has come out. It is certain he's going to become president. So he really solicits a pardon on Nixon's behalf. Ford is noncommittal, and then goes back to his own advisors, including a guy named Bob Hartman, and describes this meeting and said, and Hartman, who was a sort of a perpetually angry person, said, "You should have thrown Haig right out of your office. That was totally inappropriate." And Ford winds up late at night calling Haig on the phone and saying, "Just so it's clear, I made no commitments to you." All of which is I think, proof that he did make no commitments. And the other important point about the deal hypothesis is by the time Haig came to Ford with the deal, Nixon was doomed anyway. He was going to be forced out of office. So Haig really had nothing to offer at that point. So I can understand why people were suspicious of a deal. Some people have said there was a deal. I come down very clearly in the view that there was no deal.
And just to follow up, one might have expected that during this period they were conferring some, and Nixon was, beginning to prepare him. On the contrary, right? For all we know, zero contact in the day between Ford and Nixon in the week before. Is that right?
On both sides. On the one side, Nixon treated his vice presidents, first Agnew and then Ford, more or less like Eisenhower treated him when he was vice president,
right?
Which is he basically ignored him. So Ford had very little contact with Nixon and even less substantive contact with Nixon when he was vice president. Ford also, on his own behalf, like the Michigan football player he once was, thought of himself as a team player. And he never wanted to do anything that would jeopardize Nixon's presidency. So most of the 8 months he was vice president, he spent traveling around the country supporting Republicans in the 1974 midterms, and didn't want to be accused of trying to force Nixon out and getting the presidency for himself. The problem with that, and this is a significant part in my book, is that Ford stayed so far away from Watergate, from the politics, from pardons as a legal issue. He takes over on August 9th, and he knows nothing about what's going on with Watergate, including the very important issue of what should happen to the White House tapes and all of Nixon's papers as president. And he gets, I think it's safe to say, flustered by all that and views the pardon as a way of sort of cutting through it all, but it doesn't work out that way, and he's haunted by the pardon.
Got it. And it's interesting, people don't necessarily remember, he was a middling party guy, member of Congress, who all of a sudden is elevated to the vice presidency and then takes that other jump. But for purposes of what we're discussing, Jeff, it seems pretty clear that if that deal happened, it would have been the Haig-Ford meeting. And
right, it certainly was not solicited by Nixon. Haig was Nixon's instrument, as he was after Ford took over as president as well. He was a key intermediary there.
Okay, so now let's go back to Jeff Toobin's counter conventional thinking and your reason for feeling that the initial very negative reaction, and that's what I was a kid, but you had that sense that thank you. You had that sense of Ford's having been pilloried, maybe of losing the election to Carter, which is an incumbent loss, unusual, although he'd never been elected. Anyway, your view, I think, is not a political view. It's a moral, ethical, constitutional view.
But also political.
So give me your thoughts. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that was really fun about writing The Pardon is sort of going back to the constitutional and political history of pardons.
Yeah.
And pardons are an anomaly within the American constitutional system because as I think most people know, the Constitution is set up as a system of checks and balances, that the three branches of government, are, at least in theory, supposed to restrain and check one another. Pardons are different. There's no check on a pardon. Pardons, presidents have really absolute authority when it comes to pardons. You can't a pardon can only apply to federal crimes, not state crimes. A pardon cannot apply to future misconduct. You can't sort of give people a license to violate the law. But with those two limitations, it really is an absolute power. And for that reason, I think presidents should be particularly judicious and limited, because it is so different from the rest of our system. The idea that cutting off the criminal justice system is something that will benefit the society as a whole is, I think, a flawed concept. And that was the whole concept behind the Ford pardon. The idea that you would give a break to Nixon and somehow that would make the country feel better. I think especially at that moment in 1974, when all of Nixon's top advisors, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, were all about to go on trial for the Watergate cover-up, which they all did with and for the benefit of Nixon. It was just egregiously unfair to give Nixon a free pass when his subordinates were facing justice. Now, if Ford wanted to pardon Nixon after he'd been convicted and, so he didn't go to prison, as a symbol that we don't want our presidents in prison, that would be one thing. But giving him a free pass from any accountability for Watergate, I thought was a big mistake. And I think as you look and in the book, I go forward all the way to the January 6th pardons, and there are a lot of bad pardons out there, and there are some good ones, but it's important to remember that pardons are a departure from how our system is usually supposed to work. So there's got to be a pretty good reason to do it, and often there isn't.
Yeah, well, and particularly lately, and that is how people think about it. So let me just serve it up, because when we were thinking about Trump, and I wanted to ask you about what you think the sort of cultural consequences have been for the Trump and Biden pardons. But the idea was something like, he's still got supporters. The country is roiled. People are resentful that he's being forced out. I'm now talking about Nixon in '74. Those, the left is pushing him out. And the spectacle of him in the dock would have roiled the country more. Whereas here he does that Nixon wave in the helicopter, goes away, as, at least speaking personally, I've so often thought in the last few years, how great would that be if we could just do that with Trump, forget about the vengeance, but make him go away. So is it your thinking then, that part of the argument that it just pacified a very roiled society? Do you think that's inaccurate, or it's just counterbalanced by the unfairness?
Both. Yeah. I think it's inaccurate. I mean, by pardoning Nixon, Ford made himself part of the Watergate story. Yeah. Ford made himself a participant in the Watergate cover-up, which he wasn't. He played no part and did nothing wrong when it came to Watergate. And it is worth noticing and remembering that the only thing most people remember about Gerald Ford's brief presidency is that he pardoned Nixon. Yeah. So it didn't accomplish the idea of sort of unroiling the system. And the other thing about giving Nixon a break because he had been president, I don't think he deserved one. And ultimately, when it comes to pardons, you have to make that judgment: is, does the pardon address something that needs to be addressed? Has the criminal justice system failed in some way? Yeah. And I don't think it has.
And typically, not just here, but across the world where it exists, there are certain prerequisites like a real contrition.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
So let's just, I hope to talk to you more and at greater length, but I just want to get your thoughts on, by the way, congratulations. Good luck with the book that's just, you're birthing your 10th child here, and it must be exciting. But what's your sense of the legacy, culturally, politically, legally, of the Nixon-Ford pardon and how it contributed? And remember, we have I think, abusive use of pardons in Trump 1.0 and in Sheriff Joe and other.
I have a whole chapter about the first term pardons, which are way worse than most people remember.
That's
just
right. I mean,
shockingly awful.
I saw them as impeachable at the time, and I used that. I think that concept prudently, but anyway. From there, and now, of course, we've had the biggest explosion of pardons and controversial ones, starting with Biden, and of course the big ones from Trump. And they're probably not, there'll be some more tomorrow, maybe. So, what's your sense of the connection what the Ford pardon bequeathed to us that it has had an impact on these last few years?
Well, there's been an ebb and flow. After the Ford pardon, there was such a backlash that when you come to Carter, Reagan, the first President Bush, there are very few pardons. I mean, the presidents shy away.
Yeah.
Well, that the Iran-Contra pardons at the very end of the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, also bad pardons, I think.
Yeah.
But just presidents shied away from it. Barack Obama, and again, there were mistaken pardons. Bill Clinton's pardon of Mark Rich, the fugitive financier, really soured his last days in office for good reason. It was a terrible pardon. You shouldn't pardon someone who runs away rather than facing the criminal justice system. Barack Obama took office, and the movement against mass incarceration had started, and he was generally a supporter of it. And he commuted more than pardoned, which means he ended the sentences, but he didn't, give them a total free pass for I think about 1,500 low-level drug offenders. And that, I think, was a very appropriate use of the pardon. There was no sense of, privileges for wealthy people. It was a transparent process for people who really shouldn't have been in prison anymore.
Or if I can just interrupt, we've come to there's been social pride, like Carter and the draft dodgers. We now feel differently than we felt before, and for that reason,
right.
Yeah.
And again, Carter with the draft dodgers, he had promised to do that during the campaign. He did it in an open way. He didn't single out his supporters for special treatment. And that, again, I think was an appropriate use of the pardon power. But once you get into Trump 1, Biden, and then Trump 2, you see pardons moving into the realm of corruption, of special treatment for insiders. And I think one of the worst things about Joe Biden's pardon of Hunter Biden and then the other members of his family was that he created this sense of equivalence with Trump, whether it was the corrupt first-term pardons or the January 6th, that, well, they all pardoned their buddies. I do think that Trump's pardons were far worse and certainly more numerous. But Biden gave Trump supporters the opportunity to say, "Well, it's all just the same," and I don't think it's the same. But Biden gave that chance.
The book is The Pardon: The Politics of Presidential Mercy. You go to your bookstore today; it should just still be in the boxes, and tell them to open the box,
get them out of the boxes,
and out of the. And we hope to be talking to you more about it because for good or for bad, for bad, it is a very important, enduring issue on the contemporary political scene. Jeff, good luck with it, and thanks so much.
Thanks, pal.
See ya. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.